Let's talk about self-referential language. This video is going to outline what self-referential language is, why you should avoid it, and how you can avoid it in academic writing. The first question is, what is self-referential language? Self-referential language is any language with which you refer to yourself or your work within the work itself. Example, that's the bottom line because Stone Cold said so. Now, here within the speech, Stone Cold is referring to himself. So this is self-referential language. We might also see it when people begin their essays with a phrase such as, in this paper, I will argue that Bret Hart is the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. We begin by saying, in this paper, I will argue, referring to the paper itself and referring to the author. Likewise, people sometimes refer back to something. As previously mentioned, to be the man, one must beat the man. And we see here again, as previously mentioned, referring back to something that was already said in the writing and referring to the writing itself. May also lead in to a list. For example, The Rock is the greatest of all time for the following reason. It doesn't matter what the reason is. And as we lead in there, we say for the following reason, telling the reader the text is about to explain this. So, what's the problem with self-referential language? Well, one issue is that it's wordy. Another thing is that it can be seen as informal. Personal pronouns and self-referential language are often seen as informal, and most especially, it can create awkward phrasing that calls attention to itself and pulls the reader out of the narrative. For example, if somebody says, "Who's the greatest women's champion of all time?" How would you reply? Would you begin by saying, in the words I'm about to speak, I will answer your question? Rhea Ripley is the greatest women's champion of all time? Let us turn our attention back to the setup for that answer. In the words I'm about to speak, I will answer your question. If you had a friend ask you a question, you're not going to tell them that you're about to answer it before you answer it. You'll just talk about your subject rather than talking about your subject. How can we eliminate self-referential language? We can simply focus on our purpose and rationale. Example, in this paper, I will compare 3 treatments for depression: psychotherapy, pharmacological approaches, and psychopharmacological approaches. Now, here we begin with, in this paper, I will compare. You're telling the reader what you're going to do instead of explaining them why what you're about to do is important or what the value is. And we also add 6 words to the word count here. Why is this comparison important? Well, you're doing the comparison because you want to determine effective treatments for depression. So begin with an emphasis on that. To determine effective treatments for depression, it is important to compare psychotherapy, pharmacological approaches, and psychopharmacological approaches. Here we begin by establishing our purpose to determine effective treatments. Now the reader knows why we're having the conversation rather than simply being told, well, we're going to have this conversation now. They see the value of it and they're going to be invested in what follows. Now, what about referring to the content itself rather than referring to what you're going to do? You might be referring back to what you wrote or forward to what you're about to say. Simply cut out the language. Example, the 3 greatest wrestlers of all time are as follows: Sting, Undertaker, and the Macho Man. Now, in this context, we begin the list by saying as follows, as these words that follows. But we don't even need that. We can just jump into our list. As an alternative, we could simply cut out the words as follows and go straight into our list. The greatest wrestlers of all time are Roman Reigns, the Great Muta, and Andre the Giant. We may also say, as was previously mentioned, Rhea Ripley is the greatest women's champion ever. Here we begin with as was previously mentioned. If you've already said this in your document, your reader knows that you've said it. You don't have to call attention back to it. So all we do is eliminate those four words. Rhea Ripley is the greatest women's champion ever. So, a quick summary for the self-referential language. It's wordy. So, we want to reduce our word count right effectively. We can oftentimes just eliminate the self-referential language. It also comes across as awkward because we're talking about our subject instead of directly talking about our topic. And it can come across as informal. How can you avoid it? Focus on the purpose of your arguments. Rather than telling the reader what you're about to do, tell them why the conversation you're about to have is important and what its purpose is. And you can simply delete superfluous references to your text. Rather than saying as follows or as was previously mentioned, just cut those words out altogether and get straight to your list or straight to reasserting the key point that you wanted to call the reader's attention back to. I hope that you now have a clear understanding of what self-referential language is, why it's important to avoid it in most academic contexts, and how you can avoid it. If you do have any questions, leave them below. And until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.